So now we're going to handle another case, also related to stopwatches. If we start this stopwatch and then close the application, and if we'll keep the application closed for more than 1 hour, we should keep only those idle seconds until the hour when the stopwatch was initially started. In other words, all these stopwatches should count no more than 1 hour. If I'm going to start tracking the time when the current hour equals to 0, and then I'm going to rewind the time 1 hour forward, and let's see what is going to happen. So let's start tracking the time for the coding activity. Then let's go back to the editor and modify the current date. Instead of the midnight, let's use first hour. In the browser, we'll see that the current hour is now the first hour, but the previous stopwatch shows the time that is more than 1 hour. But we have to prevent this behavior so that every stopwatch will count only up to 1 hour. So to fix this, we have to modify the code inside storage.js. In here, we are syncing idle seconds with timeline item objects, and specifically, we calculate the difference between two dates, current date as well as that date when our application was last active. But besides doing that, we also have to determine if our application was closed for more than 1 hour. So we'll have to do a couple more checks. Actually, one more check. Let's start. I'm going to create another function and call this function calculate idle seconds, which is going to accept one parameter, which is the date when our application was last active. And then instead of doing this kind of calculation, we'll call our function calculate idle seconds, passing last active at date. Let's move that calculation inside this function calculate idle seconds. First of all, we'll find the difference between two dates, the current date as well as the date when our application was last active. This way, we're gonna get amount of seconds passed since the moment we have closed the application. Here will be an additional check to determine whether our application was inactive for more than 1 hour, but if not, we'll basically do what we had been doing before by simply returning this value, but before this has to be converted to seconds. So let's divide this value by milliseconds in second constant like this. So with this logic, our application is going to function correctly only in those cases if we start measuring time for a particular activity, then close the application and open the application again if current hour wasn't passed yet. So now let's start handling the case when we'll keep our application closed for more than 1 hour. So to determine if we kept it closed for more than 1 hour, let's use the following check. Firstly, let's get an hour of last active at date and compare this hour with the current hour. We can get the current date by calling function today and call function get hours to get the current hour of this date. And so if these two hours are not equal, that means we should calculate the difference not between current date and the date when our application was last active, but we actually have to find the date which corresponds to the end of an hour when we started tracking the time for an activity. We're going to use a separate function to calculate end of hour. Let's call it get end of idle hour. This function is going to accept last active at, and then once we find this date, we'll subtract the date when we have closed the application last time, which is last active at date. And now the only thing left to do is actually implement get end of idle hour function. Right here, let's declare this function. It will take one parameter last active at. So here let's declare a new constant that is going to store the date we're about to find, which is end of the hour when we start tracking the time for an activity. Firstly, we'll create this date based on last active at date, like so. And now we're going to rewind this date forward by 1 hour. So we can do it in this way. Firstly, let's call method setTime, which accepts amount of milliseconds. Let's get amount of milliseconds of end of idle hour date first. And to this date, we have to add amount of milliseconds in 1 hour, which we can get by multiplying two constants, seconds in hour and milliseconds in second, like this. Next, we'll reset amount of minutes, amount of seconds, as well as amount of milliseconds for this date. And this way we'll find the date that corresponds to the end hour when we start tracking the time for a particular activity. And eventually we'll return this date. Before returning, let's just print out this value to the console and see what date we'll get. So let's test it out. I'll start tracking the time for the coding activity, while the current hour corresponds to midnight hour. And then if I'll rewind the current time 1 hour forward, we'll actually see that the current time is now 1 AM. But take a look at the time that the first stopwatch shows. Now it doesn't exceed 1 hour. This is exactly what we were trying to achieve. Even though our application was closed for more than 1 hour, still, the first stopwatch doesn't show amount of seconds that exceeds 1 hour. And also, as we can see in the console, that date that corresponds to the end of hour when we start tracking the time for the coding activity is actually 1 AM, because we started tracking the time for coding activity when the current hour was midnight hour. So everything is working fine. And also, as you may remember in one of the previous lessons, we have increased the speed of timeline indicator by simply shifting it down every second to the time that corresponds to 60 seconds. But we actually have to shift it down every second by the time that corresponds to 1 second. So there is no need to multiply milliseconds in second by seconds in minute constant anymore. So let's remove this constant from here. And while we are inside time.js module, let's scroll up, remove unused constant. And also there is no need to modify the current date by mutating amount of hours. So we can comment out this line for now. And now our timeline indicator will start moving down from the current hour. Let's also remove that console log statement inside storage.js and finish this lesson. Link to the source code of this project will be in the video description.